Okay, all right. So tonight we're going to look at momentum, and it is. We maybe don't have something the magnitude of slaying a giant, but we have these victories. We have moments in our life where God does something big or great, and we come out of that, and in that moment, maybe this might be the highest point in your life in terms of your spiritual journey, your relationship with God. And we find that oftentimes it's hard to maintain that momentum, that we kind of then go into valleys. We just can't ride that high for very long without being discouraged. And so what I want us to look at here tonight is the idea of how do we maintain momentum in our relationship with God when we've experienced these great victories. So we're going to start there at chapter 17, verse 50, and we're going to go through all the way through the first 5 verses of chapter 18. So it says, "So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron." So think about those that are chasing the Philistines and those who are running from Israel. The only difference in this and what it was the day before, the only difference in this from what it was an hour before is what? What's the only difference in the face-off that they're engaged in here? Yeah, the giant's dead. That's the only thing in this. Still the same amount of army on both sides, except for the giant. That's the only difference. And now there's great courage on the side of Israel because they're chasing them, and there's great fear on the side of the Philistines because they're running from them. And so everything's changed in this moment just because of the giant. Now remember, the giant is 8.5 feet tall. He's a big guy, but he's not impossible to take down. He's obviously, that's the case because he's been taken down. But now everything's changed, and the attitude and the mindset of Israel has changed in a moment here. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And we'll look at what that kind of means, this plundering, here in just a minute. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. But he put his armor in his tent. And so he takes the armor of Goliath, and he places it in his tent. And it doesn't really say anything more about that, like he's putting it there for when he grows into it. He's putting it there for when it might come in handy. It doesn't tell us the reason that he takes it, but I think we can kind of get a pretty good guess for the reason for that. And so as soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son the boy is." Now, this has happened multiple times in this account, where Saul does not recognize David. And so we might wonder why that would be, since, remember, David had gone and played for Saul and calmed his spirit, and they would call him and bring him in for that reason. But at this point, the question maybe isn't that he doesn't recognize. In fact, what's the question? You've got to ask, what is the question he's asking? Whose boy is it? It isn't who is that kid? It's whose boy is it? So maybe his inquiry more is related to the family that he comes from, which he does not recall, apparently. And so the king said, "Inquire whose son the boy is." And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." Chapter 18, verse 1. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And so in this moment, there's this deep connection, this friendship, this intimacy between the two that is now developed that will last how long? Yeah, to at least Jonathan's lifetime. And so then, and Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. So that Saul set him over the men of war, and this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So I want you to think about maybe a time that really you can really think of as a high point in your life and your relationship with God, your life as a Christian. Time where you would really look back and you can see that in that moment God was working in a way just more significant than any other time. And maybe you would even look back and say, there's never been a time since then that God has worked so profoundly in my life. And I want you to, as practically as you can, kind of identify that. And then I want you to think about this. That level, that plane that you were on at that time, did you remain on that plane in terms of your relationship with God, that the spiritual passion and fervor you had at that moment, did it always stay that way? No, it doesn't, does it? We go up the mountains, but we live in the valleys, right? And so we have that experience, but yeah, the next day we go back to the things that happened the day before that. And so we don't always, I shouldn't say we don't always, we never able to live at that high point always. And yet, what often happens is there's this moment, there's this chance for us to really build on something, to really gain momentum and progress in a way that we haven't before. But so often it seems that we miss that momentum. We don't get the chance to do what we